Hey everybody, Professor Snart just checking in here as we get just past our first due date. I'm recording this on Thursday, so our due date for Unit 1 was Wednesday, yesterday, August 24th. Pretty simple start, obviously, in Unit 1, just kind of getting people introduced to each other. One thing I want to just kind of highlight a little bit, and I'm just going to click myself into the unit, is just to remind people that in addition to doing your own student homepage, which is obviously the main thing that you're doing for that exercise, it is kind of equally important actually that you've looked at other people's, just again to get that sort of introductory, information about people, find out about people's backgrounds and interests and that kind of thing, but also to see the picture just so you feel a little more connected to what's going on. So there was that, and then just the discussion board. So again, pretty simple Unit 1 to get the ball rolling a little bit. We look at our next due date, which is not until next Wednesday, August 31st. And again, the unit assignment here for Unit 2 is pretty straightforward. Just making sure everything looks all right. So a short little reading, just kind of introducing the unit itself. The reading assignment from the textbook, which is a little bit longer, and then a pretty simple discussion board. Again, a fairly light unit, just as we get the ball rolling for the semester, everyone gets sort of situated in terms of Blackboard and everything else that's going on. So fairly straightforward, but it's one of those units that, again, kind of gets the momentum going for us in terms of how we want to think about what's going on for us and for our class for this this whole semester. So in some ways we're just laying the groundwork. And I'll talk about this again for Unit 3, and you'll see that Units 2 and 3 are kind of related in terms of where do poems come from, or how do we think about ourselves as poets in order to generate quality poems. And some people, sometimes you run into writer's block and you're not even so much cared about quality, you take anything. Part of I don't want to say the solution to writer's block, but certainly one of the ways to combat it. And one of the things that I really want to stress for us this term is that you think about not just that moment of writing or the act of writing itself as kind of a singular event. It happens once and then it's done. But there's all of that lead up, which isn't just making notes to yourself or that kind of thing, but is a sort of habit of mind that you want to develop in terms of where do poems come from? What's the inspiration for them? And part of that is thinking about yourself as a poet. And in fact, Unit 3 will have us looking at a couple of expressions of this very similar idea of how the poetic mind sort of works. And this, the idea of talking about a poetic kind of mindset isn't a way of saying that it's good or bad or better than some other way of looking at the world necessarily. We might think that it is, but obviously we're biased as writers. But it does pay to think about how you think, sort of a metacognitive approach to things. And is there a way, even if it's just for the course of this term, just as a sort of experiment, to think about yourself more consciously as a poet or as a writer, someone who approaches the world. And that doesn't mean like the big sort of problems of the world, just your day-to-day experience in the world as an artist, someone who wants to take experience and use language to communicate those experiences or those details or those ideas to other people in meaningful ways. So that doesn't just begin when the pen hits the paper or you begin typing on the computer. It really begins all the time. I mean, it's an ongoing way of kind of looking at the world. So in other words, you really want to consciously think about yourself as a poet all of the time. And it doesn't mean you need to announce this to people. And obviously, and this is a discussion that we could have, but is a little broader maybe than what's manageable here, is the whole idea of like being a poet is sort of freighted with all this baggage, positive or negative, depending on the situation that you're in. So we don't need to make this a big public display of being a poet. You don't need to mope around or smoke nasty cigarettes or wear a beret or something like that. It really is just a way of kind of looking at the world. And I think Units 2 and 3 really go together nicely because we're talking about this idea of thinking of yourself as a poet, and as part of this notion of like where poems come from, where inspiration comes from. And of course, Unit 3 then has us actually looking at a couple of ideas of how the poet's mind might work. And yours might work differently, but the point is not to tell you how to think as a poet, but really to think about how you, in particular, think as a poet. Not that it's right or wrong, but that you need to be aware of this kind of thing. The other component to thinking about ourselves as writers, as artists, as poets, is really to think about ourselves as craftsmen or craftspeople. In other words, poetry is a skill. It's a craft that we want to practice, which means that our choices within the context of writing and revising poems always need to be intentional. So think about a craft that's as kind of material or physical as like building a birdhouse, or if you work on cars or anything kind of mechanical like that. That's a craft where attention to detail is crucial. You don't just sort of hope that things work out, especially if it's your own car that you're working on. You need to be meticulous. You need to make the right choice in terms of, or the right kind of conscious or intentional choice about where this piece goes, how do these two pieces fit together, and all of that kind of stuff. So if you think about this notion in terms of being a poet, it means sitting down to write, and often we think of poetry as just, oh, I feel this, and oh, I'm just going to write that because it feels good. That's a good place to start, maybe. But then you need to think about yourself as a craftsperson, as someone who is practicing a skill, as a poet. You need to think of yourself as a poet, which means that if you capitalize all of the first words in every line of your poem, so it's all caps down the side, it's not that that's right or wrong, but that needs to be an intentional choice. Just like putting two pieces of the birdhouse together. You don't just sort of stick sticks and drive some nails in and just smother it with glue and, wow, that'll do. I meant to build a birdhouse, but all those details, well, they'll just work themselves out. You are intentional about every single one of those choices. Does a comma go someplace? Does a punctuation mark go at the end of the line? Does it not go at the end of the line? Do you break a line at a certain place? Do you use this word versus that word? All of those meticulous choices need to be intentional. So you can't just come and say, well, I wanted to write about darkness, so I just wrote some stuff. That's maybe where the notion of inspiration kind of begins, with this idea, but the process afterwards needs to be one where you are very intentional about the craft of poetry. So really this is what Unit 2 and Unit 3 are getting us into, thinking about ourselves as poets, as how do we view the world, or how do we experience the world, and then how do we begin to take those various kinds of experiences and emotions and images and all of that stuff, how do we then function as craftspeople to bring that together in this piece of work, this piece of art that we would want to share with somebody else. So I'll leave off then with maybe this last notion of how you really have to think about what you're doing for this term. Is there's sort of two kinds of writing that, very generally speaking, people do, and it doesn't matter what genre it is, but there's sort of a therapeutic writing. You feel just crappy one day, you're really mad at somebody, somebody cut you off in traffic, you hate the fact that you have to pay taxes, whatever. You need to process that somehow. Some people, lift weights, some people garden, some people write poems, some people do all of that stuff. That is great. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that kind of therapeutic, getting it out of your system writing. What generally happens, though, is that the moment we get that on paper, it's sort of done with, and we don't necessarily want to or need to think about it anymore, which is precisely why it works, right? You get that out, it's done, it's gone off the table. That is precisely not the kind of writing that we're doing for this class, which sounds kind of aggressive to say maybe. And if that's the place that you start, that is maybe okay. Again, a kind of source of inspiration is just getting something on paper. But we always want to be conscious that we're not writing for our own personal therapy in terms of this class. Again, nothing wrong with that therapeutic writing. I'm just saying for this class, that's not what we're going for. We are writing as craftspeople, as poets, as people who want to impact other readers, share our work with other readers, who are going to be pretty generous, let's be honest. If they're reading a poem, it's because they've sought it out, that they're interested in this kind of thing. So you actually have a fairly sympathetic reader. The last thing you want to do is piss that reader off by just pouring something that's very personal about how you got cut off in traffic and how you just hate this one guy. And then, hey, here's my poem, and it's very useful for you in terms of the therapeutic side of it, but your reader's going, well, what does this do for me exactly? All it does is express your anger, and I'm just not interested in you telling me how angry you are. That doesn't really work for me. So you want to take that kind of therapeutic impulse and really think in terms of your poem shows up in a poetry magazine somewhere that someone across the country opens up, and they are generous. They're ready to go. They've bought this magazine or found it. They've turned to the page. It's a poem. That's what they were looking for. And you want to reward that effort by providing them with something that you have clearly spent intentional and meticulous time on, that you've made conscious choices about what word goes where, what's capitalized, where does punctuation go. This isn't just, well, I got it down on paper, so great for me, now you get to read it. Your reader deserves to see the effort that you've put into a poem. And I'll just sort of condition all this by reminding you that a lot of the writing, or maybe all of the writing we're doing for this class, is not necessarily getting you to that final, perfectly polished place. We're somewhere in the middle. So when we do a workshop, for example, you're submitting a poem that is not completely finished. It might be one that you have questions about or intentions to go further with. So it's not like for every poem you have to submit this perfectly worked out, polished, finished, pristine work of art. By the same token, you don't want to submit things to your generous readers that don't reflect any kind of effort on your part to think of yourself as a poet, as a craftsperson, as somebody who's made intentional and conscious choices about the use of language, right? You just don't want to look sloppy. It's not fair. If I'm going to spend the time reading your poem, I better get the sense that you've spent a lot more time writing and revising it. I often think that this class should be called not, poetry writing, but poetry revising. Because honestly, the writing part is usually pretty easy, just getting something down on paper. It's the revising part that is a lot trickier. In fact, it's always easier if you think about it. If you have to write a poem, it's easier to write something new than it is to legitimately pick something old up and really work at revising. You can edit for typos and stuff, but true revision is really the game that we're playing here, and is much harder than just spitting out new kind of therapeutic poems over and over again. Okay, so that's lots to digest and think about. Continue on to Unit 2, and of course make sure you check into the grade book just to see you got full points for Unit 1. Okay, that's a lot. I'll talk to everybody soon.